Hi, this is Brian Bieron with PlatformEconomyInsights.com, and I was asked to give a quick briefing today on the bill from Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri that is about the concept of political neutrality in content moderation. So Senator Hawley, who's a really interesting guy, he's a young Republican conservative senator from Missouri. He is very interested in technology policy and in particular what he sees as some meaningful downsides to the largest digital platforms. So he's really made a name for himself in his first 6 months in the Senate on that topic. So he recently introduced a bill. It's S-1914, and it calls on the largest, what he describes as big tech companies, to have politically neutral content moderation policies. Yes, it sounds a bit complicated. And the leverage he proposes is that those big tech companies will need to have their content moderation policies approved by the Federal Trade Commission as being politically neutral in order for them not to, quote, lose their Section 230 liability protection. So there's a lot of big issues here. I'll start with a reminder as to Section 230. What is it? So this is a provision that was created by the Congress in 1996 at the very dawn of the modern internet as part of the Communications Decency Act. So basically this provision says that internet service providers, which are not the access providers, but instead the services. In this case, we're talking about companies, he's talking about companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter. Those companies have actually a two-sided protection on the liability front. Number one, those companies are not liable for the communications created by their users. This actually kind of dates back or is a tradition that comes out of the telephone company regime. Basically, the phone companies are not liable when people do bad things using the phones. It's not the responsibility of the phone company for their users. So there's a liability standard that basically says when users create content on these platforms, that it's not the platform that's responsible. That often is the highlight when people talk about Section 230. It's the idea that in some way these platforms have a beneficial liability regime because they're not responsible to police their users. But there's actually a second part of Section 230 as well. And the original creators, the original authors of Section 230 are very serious and interested in this second part. So, for example, there was recently an editorial, and actually an op-ed, in the Wall Street Journal by former Congressman Chris Cox, who was one of the authors of Section 230, along with still current Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon. So Chris Cox noted that while there's a lot of attention given to the provision in Section 230 that says that an internet service provider is not responsible for their users' actions, that the second half of it was that those internet service providers would not be liable when they make decisions to moderate the content on their platform. So the original intent was to allow platforms to actually moderate their communications services. The idea being that they would be given flexibility to take things down that they thought were problematic. At the time, it was very much an era where, for example, pornography showing up on internet communications platforms was considered problematic, and that the platforms themselves should have the ability to take things down without being concerned about the liability that might come from taking things down. The idea that essentially you take down too much, or you take down things in a way that appear unbalanced. So, Section 230 allows both. Now, how does this play into the idea of political neutrality, the thing that Senator Hawley is talking about? He's obviously concerned and making it clear that he believes that the largest communications platforms are not neutral in their political views or in the standards that they use when they moderate content in the political space. So he might believe, and in fact talks about, the idea that more conservative voices on some of these platforms tend to be taken down or have their activity restricted more, he would say, than more liberal voices. And he would attribute this to the political leanings of the people that run these companies or the political leanings of most of the employees of these companies. I'm not going to talk about whether he's right or wrong. I will simply say that while we have a lot of political leaders concerned about the moderation practices of these platforms, they tend to come from both sides of the political aisle, and when they're concerned, they tend not to be concerned about the same activity. So literally, you have President Trump regularly criticizing the largest platforms about what he sees them, in his mind, doing in terms of restricting the voices of conservatives, while you've recently had a lot of attention to frustration and criticism from Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi about the fact that a video that was modified and used in a way to criticize her about, whether or not she was drunk, for example, when she was speaking publicly, and it was an obviously doctored video, she was concerned and opposed to the practices of some of the largest platforms in terms of not restricting and taking that down. So you have both sides concerned about the political implications of these moderation policies, but they don't actually agree on the kinds of things that should be taken down, because this is politics, and what one side might see as an abuse, the other side probably sees as free speech, same in the other direction. So this bill and the general concept here is that the large platforms would be required to show that their practices are neutral, and they would essentially have to go in front of the Federal Trade Commission every 2 years to get this certification. Now, I think we're a long way from this kind of thing getting enacted because of a couple of hurdles, including that political problem that I just mentioned. The two sides actually don't agree in many cases on what abusive speech is and what should be taken down. I would note that Senator Hawley, about 2 months ago, introduced a bill that would have created a do not track regime for internet businesses. Not going to get into the bill here. I'll probably do a different briefing that dives a little deeper on that bill. But I would note that his do not track bill was introduced with two very senior Democrat senator co-sponsors. So those two Democrats, Mark Warner of Virginia and Dianne Feinstein of California, joined Senator Hawley in a bipartisan bill on do not track. Now, we had no Democrats join Senator Hawley when he introduced his political neutrality bill. And I think that's worth noting. The other thing I think to keep in mind as you look at this Hawley bill is that it's a very clear example of how competition policy concerns, and when I say that, what I mean concerns about the dominance of the largest platforms. There's a lot of that going around. It doesn't take a rocket scientist in the policy space to see that the massive size, scope, and influence of the largest digital platform companies, obviously Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, are right at the top of the list. Concerns about them have a tendency to bleed into regulation as well. In other words, maybe the answer is to look at competition policy type of remedies. Maybe the answer is to look at legislative and regulatory remedies. The concern with legislative and regulatory remedies is whether or not they're going to be applied just to the very largest platforms, the ones that are causing the concern, or are they going to be applied to all platforms? And obviously, if they're going to be applied to all platforms, they become very important issues for smaller and startup digital platform businesses. And honestly, that's one of the biggest concerns here of mine and at Platform Economy Insights, is to try to focus on what are the implications for the smaller and middle-sized digital platform businesses, because they don't tend to have a voice in the policy circles. And if nothing else, being informed and on top of these things is helpful. So that's really a focus here. And so the Hawley bill regarding political neutrality is worth noting because it is framed as a focus on, literally in the senator's words, big tech companies. And so I'll close by noting, what's a big tech company? What's a big digital communications platform in this Hawley bill? Because actually, this will end up being an important question whenever concerns with the biggest platforms translates into regulatory or legislative remedies that might impact more than just them. So in this bill, what's big? What's big is 30 million active U.S. users, or 300 million active users globally, or $500 million in revenues. Now, I won't delve into questions about, well, what's the right way to define an active user, but I'll say that it's just worth noting. 30 million U.S. users, 300 million global users, or $500 million in revenues. That would be the standard that kicks in this political moderation neutrality regime. So with that, please send any questions to the Ask a Question at platformeconomyinsights.com. I look forward to the next briefing. And again, this is Brian Bieron. Until we talk policy again. Bye-bye.